My name is Keanan Koppenhaver. I'm a WordPress engineer at Doejo, a development and design agency in Lakeview in Chicago. Sorry. I got this really cool thing that I can do this in my pocket, and I put my phone in my pocket and just scroll through that stuff. So this is basically where you can find me online. I'll put this up again at the end, but I'm on Twitter at Koppenhaver. I have some of my code is on GitHub. My personal email is there. You can Keanan at Doejo is a way to reach me too, and I've recently just started blogging at levelupwp.net, kind of more advanced WordPress stuff if you're kind of trying to get into that. So a little bit about me, developer at Doejo. I've been there for about 3 years. I started on smaller sites like brochure sites for a local grocery store and stuff like that. We just got done with a project where we rebuilt the entire publishing workflow for one of the largest investment newspapers in the country. So my work has kind of run the whole gamut, and we're here to talk about more of the high-end stuff today, which is going to be pretty cool. So the number one rule of enterprise scale WordPress, and a theme that we will keep seeing throughout the night tonight, is everything takes longer. And that's a good thing, because when you compare what you're doing on your own machine just for one client or for one small website versus a website that as soon as you make a decision and write code is going to go out to 500,000 people, you want more checks and balances in place to make sure bugs don't go out or requirements don't get misinterpreted, and the editor that asked for a feature now just got a completely different feature shipped. So it's a good thing, and we'll go through all those steps today. So part one, infrastructure. This goes a little bit into the DevOps stuff that we were talking about earlier. So what kind of servers and equipment is really required to run a big site like this? Some of you may have heard of WordPress VIP, which is managed hosting by a company called Automatic. They host sites like CNN, USA Today, TechCrunch, Time, 538 if you guys have been following the election, Nate Silver and the guy who does all those cool graphs and all that stuff. And so this is kind of my rebuttal to people who say, well, WordPress is great for really small sites and then it can't scale. Well, CNN and Time magazine would disagree with you. And how they do that is they're hosted on a service called WordPress VIP. A company called Automatic, which is originally founded by Matt Mullenweg, one of the creators of WordPress, 13-ish years ago. And I just checked today, and in the last month, WordPress VIP and WordPress.com served 22 billion page views, all on WordPress. So that's pretty insane. With WordPress VIP, they do all of the security audits for you. They allow only certain plugins to make sure there's no issues there. They manage all the servers. They manage all of this infrastructure that we're going to go into for you. And they also do code review when you push a piece of code to WordPress VIP before they deploy it. They have one of their engineers look over it. And they are kind of the ultimate WordPress at scale. If you deploy a site to WordPress VIP, you are then hosted on the same platform that powers the millions of blogs on WordPress.com. So if I go and register KeananKoppenhaver.wordpress.com, I start blogging on there, I'm on the same platform that Time's running, that CNN's running, and they give people that for free, which is great. They make up for it by charging their WordPress VIP clients a lot of money because they have all the dedicated engineers and all that to support that. So just to give you an idea, again, of the scale, highscalability.com, if you're interested in the enterprise level, like crazy server stuff, that's a cool resource. Back in 2012, they did kind of an audit of WordPress.com, and they were serving 70,000 requests per second. Again, that's 4 years ago. That's probably doubled or even increased more than that since then. So it's just an insane amount of traffic, and they do it pretty well. So the one downside to VIP is that for the average client, or even the average enterprise client, it's pretty expensive because you get the code review and the engineers on call and all that stuff. It gets pretty pricey. So what are your options? What are your options if you don't want to pay that much money? There are other WordPress managed hosting solutions that we use at Doejo, and I know a lot of other people use. You may have heard of WP Engine or Flywheel. Just a quick show of hands, who's heard or used of one of these platforms? Cool. All right. So WP Engine and Flywheel are pretty much the same in the respect that you give them your code and they take care of all the servers and all that stuff for you. Which is great because they have things like caching and CDNs and stuff, which we'll get into a little bit later. But they pretty much take the whole managing servers aspect out of the equation, and they can scale much better than something like a shared host, like a Bluehost or DreamHost or HostGator or something like that. So if you're on like a shared host right now and you feel like it's a little sluggish or you're kind of reaching the limit of what it can do, definitely look at WP Engine or Flywheel. So now, because that would be a very...
I don't know Flywheel very well. Do they have the same kind of model with as WP Engine?
It's very similar. We use WP Engine for almost everything at Doejo. The project that I'm on right now just decided to go with Flywheel, which is why it was included in this talk. But they're very similar. It's just they have staging environments and production environments, so you can put your changes up before they go live and move back and forth in between them. A lot of features that, we'll get into some of that stuff a little bit later, but if you feel like you're kind of reaching your limit and you're hosting two great companies to look into. So what if you decide, okay, I'm going to be the next web developer for TechCrunch and I'm going to host all this myself on my own server? Jay-Z says no, so don't do that. If you really want to do that, you're going to have to hire a bunch of these guys, and they're going to be down in these massive server rooms in your basement all day. But since this would be a really boring end to the talk, we're going to take the red pill and go a little bit deeper and see what is actually involved if we wanted to do this. So let's just take an example site that has 4 to 6 million pages a month. This is roughly what we got done, our project that just wrapped up, what their traffic is like. So that breaks down to about 20,000 page views an hour over an 8-hour workday, assuming that not as many people are accessing it at 2 a.m. Which is pretty much 5 page views every second with a bunch of concurrent connections. So people are on the website, but only 5 people every second are actually hitting a new page. And this is definitely enterprise level, but it's also the low end of enterprise level. But this is good kind of to keep in mind for our purposes here. So the first thing that you're probably going to want, which Jeff touched on a little bit, is you're going to want to have multiple environments. So if I'm just working on a small website for a client or something like that, I just have my MacBook where I write code, and then I push the code to the server that's my live website. Once I test it on my computer, if it's good, it's fine, I push it live. That doesn't really work on an enterprise level scale. So something that you might see is something like this, which we simplified this a little bit for the last diagram, but you have my MacBook where I'm writing code and it gets pushed into Git or some sort of version control. Show of hands, people who know Git or version control or something. Good. I was hoping there'd be a majority of hands up for that. And then that eventually gets fed into some sort of build tool which handles deploying it to the different environments. So in this example, I have a dev environment, which is basically as soon as the code's written on my computer, it just shoots straight through this workflow up to the dev environment. That just means other people can look at it, people who aren't just looking over my shoulder at my computer. So that's just kind of a common area where people can look at things. Most larger organizations like this have some sort of QA team, which is just quality assurance. So after the code's been reasonably debugged by the developer and the project manager, they compile a list of requirements and send it to the QA team and say, okay, if you can break the code to make it not fit these requirements, then we have a problem. So they often get a separate environment just for them so they can be sure that this is the code that QA is testing. There's sometimes a final environment which is just beta, which means this code has been tested by developers, project managers, it's gone through QA, and it's ready to go out. Can we get other people who don't have access to our small team to test it in different places and different devices and everything? And then there's obviously production. So this on the right varies based on who you're talking to. Sometimes beta is called pre-production or staging or whatever, but there needs to be at least a couple environments between the developer's code and it getting out to millions of people a month. Does everyone know what I mean when I say like dev environment versus production? Production means like live on the internet. Well, I sometimes get some weird looks when I say it's in production. People think it's being built, but that means it's actually live on the internet. So cool. So the next thing, now that we have these fancy production servers set up, is if we're getting all of this traffic, it can be too much for one single web server to handle. So there's this concept known as load balancing, which basically means this is traditionally how it works. I have my browser, it goes and requests all my files from my web server, and the web server gives it back. And it says, okay, here's the files. If I'm the only person on the website at that time, or if there's just a couple people, that's fine. Servers can handle that. If you get into large amounts of traffic and large amounts of files being served, it sometimes becomes a problem. So what we can do is we can take that production server that we saw in the last graphic and actually split it up into multiple different physical servers. So we put what's called a load balancer in front of all those servers, And so my traffic from my MacBook comes into the load balancer, and the load balancer looks at its list of servers and says, this server's at about 80% capacity, this server's at 60% capacity. We have a server down here that's only serving 20% of its capacity. Send Keanan's traffic to that underutilized server. So it kind of balances it out so that one particular server doesn't get overloaded. That's a super high level view of how that works, but it's the basic idea. So in this way, it looks to the outside world like you just have one kind of point of reference for your code, but really behind it there's 3 different servers. In the case of a project we just worked on, there were even more than that. There were 10s and 15 servers behind that were all kind of into the load balancer. The issue there becomes, like you kind of touched on, making sure the same code is on all of those servers so that the response from each server is the same, and making sure that either they each have their own database which stays in sync with each other, or they're all referencing a single database which has its own pros and cons. But that's why people like WordPress VIP and WP Engine and Flywheel get paid money to do this stuff for you, because they have all those hard problems figured out already. So great, you set up multiple different environments. You now have a load balancer in front of it, which is pretty cool. We touched on why we would load balance a little bit. Servers are pretty busy, so if you just have one web server and nothing else, it has to serve all of your HTML, all of your styling, all of your JavaScript, all of your images, all of anything. If you have huge PDFs on your site, it has to serve those too. In the case of WordPress, it has to run through all your templates and make sure that all the template code is working properly. It has to grab your data from your MySQL database and pull it in. It's a lot to do. So if you're relying on one server or 2 servers, it may end up looking something like this, which is why load balancing is great, because it can add 3 or 4 or 5 more people to this assembly line, which would really smooth it out a lot. And just to kind of get an idea of what that'll look like again. Okay, so caching. You're going to want some sort of caching in place. And for anyone who doesn't know what caching is, basically just putting something in front of either the server or the database or whatever you're trying to cache that for repeated requests already knows the answer to the request before it hits the server. So we're going to start with how we can cache our static assets, which is called front-end caching. So for CSS and JavaScript in particular, and also images, those aren't going to change every millisecond or even every hour or every few hours. So if you have 10,000 hits coming to your website between 9 and noon, odds are that they're all going to be served the same CSS file. So basically, we can tell the user's browser and the user's computer to, when they first get to the website, download that file once. And the next time you go to a different page, you click into an article or something like that, use the version you just downloaded instead of asking my busy web server for another version of the same file you just downloaded. The server, when it ships that file the first time, will say how long that file is good for. So for some things that you know are never going to change, you can set an expiration date of as long as a year. For some things, you could set a day expiration or just a couple hours. But it saves the server from just continually shipping files over the wire that don't change, that the user's going to need. The other side of this is, well, what if you decide that at 11:30 you need to ship a new CSS file into production, and you need to tell the next users who browse or users who were there at 9 a.m. and come back at noon that there's a new CSS file. WordPress in particular has a method when you're on-queuing your scripts that allows you to add a string to the end of the URL. So if you go to my website and load it, and it requests style.css, and Chrome downloads that for you and puts it in the cache, and I push an update to my CSS file, I can tell WordPress this is a new version as of August 10th, 2016. The next time you go to the site with Chrome, it will say style.css, question mark, and then 2016-0810, which Chrome will interpret as a new file, and it will download it again. So basically changing the URL, even just slightly, of that cached file will cause Chrome to re-download it, and so that's known as a cache buster in some cases. But anything appended onto the end of the URL string will cause that file to re-download, so you don't have to worry about the user having old styling in their browser cache. The next level, we talked about this a little, we touched on it a little bit, but is using a service called a CDN. A CDN is basically a company that has servers distributed all around the world, and they say, give us your files that you don't think are going to change, and we'll host them for you on our servers. So one example of this is a company called Cloudflare. They have servers, I think I just looked today, they have I think like 100 servers all around the world. So if I have images on my website and I upload them to Cloudflare, and somebody in South Africa goes to my site, and if they were just hosted on my server, they would have to download them all the way from Chicago all the way to South Africa. Cloudflare has a server in Johannesburg, so that rapidly increases the amount of images they can download in a given time because the server is so much closer just geographically. So when I upload my images to Cloudflare, they go to Cloudflare servers all over the world, and then they deliver them to the user based on where they are and what the closest server to them is. Again, that's something that you would never want to build out yourself. Amazon has AWS, which gives you this kind of capability. Cloudflare has it, and a bunch of other services have it, so that people like us developers don't have to build those things. So with services like WP Engine and Flywheel, they give you a CDN can be included with your hosting plan, so that can really, if you have an image-heavy site or a script-heavy site, that can really speed it up too, which is great. But something to consider if you were kind of taking this on yourself. So the next thing, if we've cached all the stuff that's on the front end, which is, like I said, styles, JavaScript, and images, what about stuff on the back end? If we have a homepage, let's say on a news site, we have one section that's the top 10 stories of today. In our same 9 to noon period, those top 10 stories of the day probably aren't going to change because the editors are busy doing other things or whatever. They're not going to update those. So every time someone hits the homepage, WordPress goes to the database and says, give me the top 10 stories of the day. And that, I mean, if the data is not changing, having WordPress go all the way to the database and come back to the user is somewhat inefficient. So there's a utility called Memcache, and basically what it does is it's very similar to what we just discussed with front-end caching, but it loads the result of those database calls into RAM, which is memory, much quicker than going into an actual database. And when a user makes a call that it sees as the same as the one a previous user made, it reads it out of memory instead of going all the way to the database, which is nice because this makes it much harder to tip over your database server, which is sometimes a problem. So it looks at a request and it says, WordPress is asking me for the top 10 stories on the homepage. Here's my response, but I'm also going to save this response in memory. And then when the next request comes in, it says WordPress is asking me for the top 10 stories. I already have the top 10 stories stored in memory. Let me just send those back to WordPress, and MySQL just keeps going as normal. It doesn't have to absorb another call, which is great when you get to the kind of levels of traffic we're talking about, because it becomes very easy for a slow database query or a complex database query or something like that to tip over a MySQL server, and then you get the dreaded error establishing a database connection message on WordPress, which I think everyone's seen.
So you're going to go over which of these high performance features are vanilla WordPress and which are WordPress plus Flywheel or WordPress?
Yeah, I mean, so all of these things you can do on your own. Like you don't have to use something like Flywheel or WP Engine, or I mean even WordPress VIP. There are Memcache plugins for WordPress. There are plugins that allow you to host your content on a CDN for WordPress. Basically, all of this stuff is covered under plugins that exist.
But it wouldn't come with a vanilla WordPress.
No, not by default. No, this is kind of, and that's kind of the crux of this talk is like WordPress out of the box is great, but there's a lot of things you can do to optimize it for kind of these higher performance environments through plugins and other things.
So all the things you're telling us about are add-ons to vanilla WordPress.
Yes, but add-ons you can do yourself if you decided to, and you can also do them piecemeal. So if you don't have a problem with you don't have many images on your site, but your site makes a lot of database calls, you can just use Memcache. You don't necessarily need to use a CDN or something like that. You can do these optimizations either one by one, or if your site really calls for it, you can do them all. But that's back to how much time do you want to spend writing code versus working on servers and DevOps and stuff like that. So it's just kind of an overview of what's possible, and you can take any one of these, and any one of these concepts that I'm going into right now could be its own meetup or 45-minute talk or whatever. So that's why a lot of the times we have server people who help us out with that stuff. But there's definitely, Google is your friend. If you see a term that looks interesting, either write it down or find the slides online. I'll post them later, and just throw it into Google and see what you get. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask a similar question, but Cloudflare has a free service that's available through many hosts.
Yep.
How does that compare to the paid Cloudflare? Do you have any idea?
I mean, like I said, I think that gives you the CDN that I'm talking about. So in many cases, that would be fine. If you're getting, I don't know what the traffic limit is on that free plan, but I think if you're getting over a certain level of traffic, Cloudflare will say, hey, you're getting enough traffic, you should pay us some money. Yeah. So yeah.
I think if people are looking for a starter, I think between Jetpack and WordPress, each of those has, I think Jetpack has a CDN option, and these are built by Automatic. So,
Yep.
I mean, that's a great, if you're looking to just kind of get your feet wet, if you're self-hosted, those two plugins can kind of get you going.
Jetpack puts you on WordPress.com for your CDN stuff. Is that right?
I think so.
Okay.
I haven't used it, but I just know that is an option within Jetpack.
Cool. Yeah, so Jetpack, for anyone who doesn't know, is kind of like the kitchen sink plugin that Automatic, the company we talked about earlier, who kind of manages the WordPress ecosystem that they provide. There's a ton of stuff you can do in there. You can only enable certain things or not, so you don't go and enable everything because you won't need it. But if you need a CDN, Jetpack has it. If you want to do easy social sharing, Jetpack has it. If you want to do like an infinite scroll thing on your site, Jetpack has that too. So Jetpack is definitely worth a look. And it's very useful for kind of, you want this stuff, but you want to make it easy, and Automatic's done that with Jetpack, which is pretty cool. Oh, we skipped one. We skipped the bottom item here. So the problem with this, again, is when the editor goes in and does change one of the top 10 stories of the day, then Memcache needs to know about it. Otherwise, the call's going to come in for the top 10 stories of the day, and it's going to give the old top 10 instead of the new ones that the editor has updated. So with most of the Memcache plugins that exist with WordPress and all that stuff, it will handle when stuff is updated in WP admin, like making sure the cache is up to date too. But if you find a solution that doesn't do that, you run into one of the two hard things in computer science: cache invalidation, naming things, and off by one errors. So you'll get that on the ride home.
Yeah.
But so that pretty much covers the infrastructure stuff. So if you've been following along at home, you've gotten your whole massive server set up with all of your caching and all of your load balancing, and you're great. So now you just need to actually write code to put on all those boxes that you set up. So you're probably going to want some sort of task management. Odds are, if you're building a site of this size, you're not working alone. The site that we just got done building, that was this scale, I think it was myself and maybe 7 other developers, 4 of whom were in LA. So you need some sort of task management system to say, yes, Keanan's working on this, Bill's working on this, whatever. So the one that we use a lot is Jira. There's also Trello. I'm sure some of you use Trello in your development as well. But basically, each of these systems kind of gives you the option to say, here's a card, and I need a feature. So I need 10 posts to display on the homepage. So I make a card called 10 posts to display on the homepage. I can then assign that to somebody and say, okay, you're in charge of making sure 10 posts display on the homepage. I can look and see, if you go back, you can kind of see, it can be categorized as to do or in progress or done. So if you have a project manager or someone who's kind of, maybe that's you and you're managing a team of developers, you can see kind of where everyone is, what is going to get done. You can put time estimates and things on here. So it's really helpful for kind of just keeping everyone organized and taking a step back and seeing the high level of a project. It's helpful if you do sprints. How many people here do sprints? It's kind of a weird thing with a couple people. A sprint is basically at a very high level. It's a time period where you say, okay, we have, say, 2 weeks. We want to work on this one feature, and we only want to work on this feature. So you could take all of the tickets in Jira or Trello that are part of that feature, move to in progress, and say we're not going to work on anything else for these 2 weeks. So it helps to kind of have all your cards, and you can say, this is what we're going to be working on, this is what matters, and nothing else matters, so we don't need to work on that for those 2 weeks. And a great thing about Jira, and I believe Trello can do it too, is it can be tied in with version control. So version control, luckily everyone raised their hands pretty much when I said to use version control, which is great. If you don't, you can stop saving your files as final or final for client 8.2 because you can see all the different stages that it's gone through here. Version control, especially if you're working with that team of multiple developers who are not in the same office, is very important. We use Git at Dojo. I use Git on my personal projects. WordPress and Automatic use SVN. People use Mercurial, or God forbid, use TFS, which is a Microsoft source control product. Whatever you use, just using something is good. What we found is branches are super important. So just like you had multiple different environments for your code, you can have multiple branches. So if I'm working on the feature that we outlined earlier to put 10 posts on the homepage, I would create a new branch called Keanan put 10 posts on the homepage. I would write all my code in there. When I got it to a point where I thought it was ready to test, I could merge it into what's called the dev branch. The dev branch is where all of the developers' code goes, and it gets deployed to that dev environment that we looked at earlier. That's the place where the code is kind of looked at, made sure everything's solid. If we need code review, which we'll look at in a little bit, that's where it gets code reviewed. And when it's finally ready, it gets merged into what's called the master branch. The master branch is kind of the record of what your application looks like in production. So code that's in the master branch should look the same as code in production. When code gets merged into the master branch, it's normally because it's just about ready to go out to production. So what's nice about this is if there was a card associated with that task, I could make the number on the card match the branch in version control. So it'd be very easy for developers working in version control and project managers working in Jira or Trello to tie those two pieces together, which is great. And yeah, like we said, one thing that's great about version control is when you need code review. So I'll just give you a minute to look at this graphic, and I'm sure many of you have been in both situations. But code review is important, and I didn't really know much about code review until the last project we did. But basically, it's just a peer review of your work. So I'm done with a feature, I think it's ready to go, I just have another developer kind of look it over. They can be very informal, they can also be very formal, where you don't let your code get merged into Git until someone else on your team has approved it. Like we said, it's part of WordPress VIP. Automatic engineers will review your code for you. It doesn't have to be someone, it doesn't have to be a senior developer or a lead developer, even if it's just kind of one of your peers. It's a great way to catch things that you normally wouldn't have caught, like those off by one errors we talked about earlier. And yeah, it's a useful double check and useful learning across the team. There's been cases where somebody else, I was stuck on a problem, and so I couldn't work on it, so I just took some code review. And I found somebody else who had a solution that would work perfectly for what I was trying to do. So I just took that solution and I applied it to my problem, and we both won in that case. Which, if I was just staring at my own code all day and just pushing my own code into Git, I would have been stuck there for a long time. So that's the benefit of just kind of sharing between your team, and even if it's not like a lead developer has to review everyone's code, it's just a double check and a possibility for sharing kind of the ideas of what's going on. Automated deployments is another, is kind of the next step. Once you get all of your code checked in and ready to go, for a while my approach was, okay, let's just drag everything into FTP and it goes up onto the server, and are you sure you want to overwrite these 10 folders? Yes, replace all and go. Which is not a great solution when you're working on a large scale. So one of the tools, this is Jenkins, one of the tools we use for deployment a lot of the times. There are a bunch of other tools that work basically the same. What it does is, Jenkins, when you tell it you're ready to go, it looks at that master branch in Git and says, okay, I'm going to assume this is what you want to push out. I'm going to pull it down. Any other tasks you've given me, I'm going to run. So if you want to compile all of your CSS, or if you want to make sure your images are super optimized or stuff like that, Jenkins can handle all of that. And it runs if you have any tests set up, functional tests or unit tests, anything like that, runs all those. And if everything is green, it deploys it out to production. So the biggest thing here is no more FTP for one, which is just sometimes a frustrating experience just by itself, even if your code's perfect. It deploys from version control, which is great because you should be using version control. And it ensures that the pre and post deployment steps are the same every time. Because you write this kind of script for Jenkins once, you tell it first do this, and then do this, and then do this. You don't have to go into your FTP program and say, well, for this to work, I have to remember to delete this one folder and rename this file to the old name and stuff like that. And if you forget once and you upload it by accident, then your whole thing is messed up. Jenkins will do that for you the same way every time. And if it fails, it means something on your server has failed, which you should look into before you just deploy all of your code. And the biggest thing is it makes deployment one less thing to think about. So you already have to write the code, make sure the code's bug-free, get the code through QA, move your tickets in Jira and all that stuff. just deployment being one less variable is a good thing in my opinion. So it also makes the code easier to write because you don't dread like having to go through the whole deployment process, especially if it's really complex. Okay, so that's kind of the general, we've covered infrastructure, we've covered how to actually, the process that goes around it. Are there any questions kind of up to this point with the stuff we've covered? Yeah.
So you, at the very beginning,
Yeah.
you talked about like the capacity of WordPress, and you said CNN and Time run on WordPress.
Mm-hmm.
Now, do they run exclusively on, you know, if WordPress.com fails, that's it, that's all they have going, or?
I
or they
think,
do
well,
run-
so every company that runs on VIP is a little bit different. I don't know the specific setup of CNN and Time. I'm pretty sure the majority of their sites are on there. The New York Times, for example, runs their blogs owned exclusively on WordPress. Their other system is something different, like their main site is something different. But yeah, there have been cases when WordPress.com has gone down and it's affected like those big name clients. Because they have all their engineers, whenever there's a critical issue with WordPress.com, I mean, email, text, and phone call go out to all of their engineers simultaneously, and they have people on the issue. We were just talking to them the other day, and I think we asked them basically what's like the longest outage you've ever had, and it was something less than an hour. Their uptime's fantastic, and they work very hard to keep it that way. So, but yeah, that is a concern. But
I mean, that is where Time magazine lives exclusively, or they?
I believe so. Yeah, I would have to look in that to make sure, but I believe that's the
just
case. Yeah.
One other small question is, you talked about cache busting.
Mhm.
By adding, just a detail, but adding on something to the URL, when does that go away? I mean, it has to go
Well,
away.
whenever you update it again, so.
Well, it just stays there until the next.
I mean, the procedure that I was talking about is if you use WP onQ script, which is a call in WordPress to include your CSS and your JavaScript files. One of the parameters that you can pass to that function is what do you want to include after the URL. So in my example, I said I wanted to include the date, basically 2016-08-10 for August 10th or whatever. So if I was pushing an update to WordPress and I knew I had added new CSS, I could go back into that onQ call and change that value from August 10th to whatever, August 15th or whatever,
So
and
it's
then
just
the
an
next
option
time.
to-
Yeah, the next time it called it would do it a little bit differently. So other systems I'm sure have a similar system. Cloudflare and other CDNs basically just have a big button that you can press and it says, okay, force everyone to request everyone who comes to the site gets to request a new thing from the cache. But yeah, so it just kind of depends. But with WordPress, just out of the box, that's something you can do. Just add that onto the URL and it will force the user to request a new version.
Keanan, I was just
Yeah.
kind of curious about like a huge site like say New York Times, what the workflow might be for contributors, because they're not going to go right to the production site.
Mm-hmm.
Are they, or
Are you talking about code contributors or talking about editorial contributors?
editorial contributors, like 500 employees writing stories,
Mhm.
or
Yeah, so editorial workflow is a whole kind of separate thing, which we dealt with a little bit. We deal with a little bit with some of our clients, but basically, there's a great plugin put out by Automatic called Co-Authors Plus, and it allows you to have a concept of guest authors. So basically, guest authors get certain permissions. They can write a story, and normally that has to be approved by a user with higher level permission, so an editor or a web editor or somebody, and the guest author can submit their story, they hit save draft, and then it can notify the editor there's a story waiting for your review, and then the editor can look it over and say it's good, publish it, or it's not good, send it back to the author, or stuff like that. So it's called EditFlow, the plugin that we used as well. So EditFlow and Co-Authors Plus are huge for kind of managing that workflow on the back end of the WordPress side, because you're right,
on
it
the
gets
live site.
yeah, it gets complicated when you don't want everyone who has access to your site just to be able to instantly publish their thoughts to millions of people. So for sure, there's a lot of checks and balances that go into that. So from the code side, a few more do's and don'ts. Anyone probably who's dealt with a WordPress site eventually has come across this situation in their functions.php file, where it's just hundreds of lines of code that you've either copy pasted from Stack Overflow or WordPress.org or wherever, and you don't really want to touch any of it because you don't know what's going to break what on the rest of your site. So don't, especially when you're dealing with a large scale project like this, is don't just dump everything in functions PHP. There are a lot of ways to kind of break things up into multiple different files, and we'll look at one of those right now. The biggest thing is for sanity when searching. So if you know you wrote a piece of code 6 months ago, and you don't know exactly which file to go into, you have to like go to your big functions file and do Command F for kind of what you think you named the function that you wrote. You can probably optimize that a little more. So one way, we use a starter theme a lot called Sage. And one way Sage goes about it, and this is maybe a little bit hard to read, but basically they have an array up here of includes. So they have a lib directory, and they have a bunch of different little PHP files in the lib directory. And basically what this code does, this is the entirety of their functions PHP file when you get the theme. So it's only 28 lines. It goes through each of these files and includes them. So if you want to, say, create a custom post type, you can create a new file in lib called lib/custom post types, put your custom post type code in there, and then put the file name in here. Now 6 months from now, when you say, oh, I registered that author's custom post type, where's the code? I need to change it a little bit, I need to include it in something else. You know, well, there's a file called lib custom post types, you just go right in there instead of scrolling through your functions PHP. And this includes, all these includes work the exact same way as if all the code was in this one file. There's absolutely no difference. So that's a big thing that can help you just stay more organized. And also if you're working with multiple developers, anyone who's used Git will know that multiple developers working on the same file results in a nasty thing called merge conflicts, which are terrible to resolve. If you break your code up into different files, multiple developers can be working on different files, and they can all be committing them and not be getting into issues tangled up with each other, which is good. So the second is kind of an addendum. Even with these multiple different files, sometimes things can kind of grow and get out of hand, get like crazy, hundreds and hundreds of lines. If anything is kind of a discrete feature on its own, if you need to do an integration with print CMS, so you want to publish your post in WordPress and then you need to handle sending your post from WordPress to the printer and then it goes out in the newspaper the next day. Or if you want to ping an editor every time an author posts a story that's ready for their review with an email, that's maybe a separate thing. You could consider building that into what's called a feature plugin. So a feature plugin is just a certain piece of functionality that all goes together and is kind of encapsulated in a plugin. This is nice because you can deploy them separately, you can work on them separately, and you don't have to worry about whether the code is in or out of the version you just deployed to production, because you can turn it on and off in the WordPress admin screen. Yeah?
One thing I found useful is setting up small plugins on the scaffolding tool for WP CLI.
Yep.
It's been really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, if you're building a plugin, definitely look at like the starter stuff that's out there to help get you started. You definitely don't need to write all this code from scratch. WP CLI, which is a command line tool for WordPress, has a lot of helpful stuff that can help you with that. There's also starter plugins on GitHub that have all like the structure for you and everything, and you can just fill it in with the functionality that you need. And again, the great thing about plugins is they can be maintained independently by a completely different team. If you need to do that, they can be deployed by themselves. If you need to fix a feature in the plugin, you don't need to deploy your entire WordPress site again. You can just deploy the updated version of the plugin. And also you can reuse this code over multiple sites if that's something you find yourself need doing. The cons are that it has to be maintained independently. So it is a separate code base and it's probably a separate repository and separate functionality. So as with anything, you don't want to divide yourself into too narrow of a focus with plugins, but it can be a good tool if you find something that this file is just a little bit too big, I'm not really comfortable with how complex it's getting and it's living in my theme. Maybe it needs its own kind of independent functionality as a plugin. Another thing, and you'll see this if you've ever opened the developer tools on any sort of large website, is websites nowadays make hundreds and hundreds of requests. So a request is to get an image or to load a piece of JavaScript or to load an ad, to hook up to Google Analytics, to pull in some code from Facebook to let people share stuff like that. Browsers do have a limit, and it differs per browser on how many simultaneous connections they will allow. So if you have a bunch of connections going out all at the same time, your site is definitely going to be impacted and load slower. so the biggest thing to take away here is if you think someone on their phone would get frustrated with you for using a large portion of their data just by loading your homepage, that's probably too big. Luckily, Chrome DevTools is really very helpful. So this is a little bit small. We'll zoom in here in a second. But this is what the requests look like when you load TechCrunch.com. So TechCrunch is a popular tech blog. It's managed on WordPress VIP, and you can see here. So this is where I hit refresh and it started loading. Each of these little individual bars is a request. So it's either a GIF or a piece of plain text or a PNG image or something like that. And it goes and it shows you each of these requests that's loading. You can see down here, we can zoom in a little bit. So that's down here at the very bottom bar. It gives you kind of all of your key metrics. So this page made 404 requests. It downloaded 3.5 megabytes of data. DOM content loaded just means how long did it take from the time the person hit the site till the time they actually saw something useful, the content that you wanted them to see. So how long did it take me to see images and headlines on the homepage? It took me almost 2.5 seconds. For all of the ads and analytics and everything to fully load, it took me just over 11 seconds. So that's pretty crazy. They've optimized it a little bit. You can see because the difference between those is so high, they've put a lot of what they know is going to load slow at the very end, so that I can see useful information before all of the stuff loads. But even still, this is kind of crazy, and it's not that uncommon. So just something to keep in mind if you get a feature request for, oh, can we add this other kind of reporting tool, or can we add another ad network, or you see that one of your ad networks is making you take 200 requests on a single page load. So that's all of that stuff has happened, and all of it is a problem. So just something to keep an eye on. And sometimes it will be out of your control, but you should always try to not do that. So in summary, like we stated at the beginning, everything just takes longer, and that's a good thing. So I hope that that's a little bit more obvious now as to why that is. And I would love to take questions if there are any.